Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of ASEAN Pacific Affairs. In this episode today, we are going to discuss about Sino-Russian relations and the tension across Eurasia. My guest today is Mr. Ali Wyne. Let me introduce my guest to the audiences. Ali Wyne is a senior analyst with Eurasia Group's global macro practice, focusing on US-China relations and great power competition. He is also a non-resident senior fellow at the Atlantic Council Scowcroft Center for Strategy and Security and a non-resident fellow at the Modern War Institute. Ali has served as a junior fellow at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, a research assistant at the Belfer Center for Science and International Affairs, and a policy analyst at the RAND Corporation. He received dual bachelor's degrees in management science and political science from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology and earned his master in public policy from the Harvard Kennedy School. Ali is a term member of the Council on Foreign Relations, a David Rockefeller Fellow with the Trilateral Commission, and a Security Fellow with the Truman National Security Project. He also serves as a member of Foreign Policy for America's Leadership Circle and a member of the American-Pakistan Foundation Leadership Council. Hello, Mr. Ali. Thank you for joining me today.
It's a privilege to be with you. Thank you for having me.
Now, let me start with my first question about the Eurasia and the crisis and Ukraine. I think many things will include to my question. What is the China's position on the tension or the Ukraine nowadays we are facing and witnessed?
So I think that China wants a peaceful resolution to tensions over Ukraine. I think it has made clear that it wants a diplomatic resolution to the tensions. And even though I'm sure we'll be talking about this more in the show, it's true that China has certainly lent diplomatic support to Russia. We do see a deepening of the relationship between China and Russia, but I think that China, on balance, when it takes sort of a panoramic view of the international system, the more that international system is conducive to stability, I think that the better for China. China wants global stability as much as possible to advance its economic interests, its strategic interests, and so I think that even as it publicly it lends support to Russia, it offers diplomatic backing to Russia. I think that it wants a peaceful resolution to the crisis. There's been some speculation, and again, I don't know if it's authoritative, but there has been some speculation that China kind of prevailed upon Russia that please, at least during the Winter Olympics, don't get up to any mischief. Please don't engage in any military adventurism that might take attention away from the Beijing Olympics. So I think it wants a peaceful diplomatic resolution, and we'll see what happens after the Beijing Olympics.
So, what will China and Russia form an alliance? Many times when we look at the proximity of this country and the relationship, it looked like an alliance. But what will be in Ukraine crisis? What will be China's attitude?
So it's interesting, actually, if you look at the relationship between China and Russia. So there has been a lot of speculation that they might form an alliance. And if you look at some of the rhetoric coming out of officials in China and officials in Russia, they sometimes will say, we don't need an alliance because our relationship, in terms of its depth, in terms of its scope, in terms of its intensity, it surpasses the qualities that you would associate with a formal alliance. And so there's a lot of lofty, grandiose rhetoric that the Chinese and Russian officials use to describe the relationship. My sense is that it's unlikely that Beijing and Moscow would pursue a formal military alliance for a number of reasons, one of which is just history. So in the Cold War, the Soviet Union and China, they did form an alliance. They had a formal arrangement. And what ended up happening was that the rigidity of that arrangement, the rigidity of having a formal alliance in which you pledge to come to each other's defense, the rigidity of that arrangement actually ended up being the relationship's undoing during the Cold War. Now, the Soviet Union and China, they both spoke the rhetoric of being anti-imperial, anti-colonial, anti-capitalist, but the Soviet Union and China, they had different understandings of how to approach their anti-colonialist, anti-imperial, anti-capitalist interpretations or imperatives. They had different ideological understandings, and that ideological rift, it actually led to an unraveling It was one of many factors that led to the unraveling of the alliance, but it was an important one. And the unraveling of this alliance was so consequential that we see this split, and the Soviet Union and China almost went to war in 1969. So I think that one of the lessons that China and Russia take today from their Cold War experience is you want to have a relationship that permits maximum freedom of maneuver in terms of your foreign policy. Well, what does that mean? It means that China and Russia, with a certain degree of flexibility, they can expand the relationship militarily, economically, technologically, diplomatically, but they don't pledge to come to each other's defense when it comes to core security interests. Well, what do I mean? I think it's noticeable that when Russia annexed Crimea in 2014, China was mum. China to this day has not formally endorsed Russia's annexation of Crimea. And on the flip side, when Russia is asked, well, what is your position on China's very expansive maritime claims in the South China Sea? Russia has not formally endorsed those claims. And so I think that China and Russia, they want a relationship that allows them to continue to develop their ties across different domains, but they don't want to bind each other to come to each other's defense in terms of core security interests. And I think that that's important. So it's basically kind of having your cake and eating it too. You get to develop your relationship. You're not burdened by the demands that are imposed by a formal alliance. And so I suspect that many sort of policymakers and commentators in both Beijing and Moscow would say, one, we don't want an alliance, and two, we don't really need an alliance to continue developing our relationship. So I think that we will continue to hear rhetoric about how, the Sino-Russian relationship, it exceeds the kind of relationship that we associate with an alliance. We might hear prognostications that China and Russia in due course one day might form an alliance. I think it's still, based on what we've seen, I think it's unlikely that the two countries will form an alliance. And I think, frankly, they don't need one, and it might actually be disadvantageous to what it is that they're trying to accomplish.
So we can say that there will be a limitation
I
between
think so.
both countries because of their different interests.
I think so, and I think it's important. It's important that when we appraise the Sino-Russian relationship, that we discuss what it is, but also, at least as importantly, what it isn't. So on the former side of the ledger, what is the Sino-Russian relationship? I think it is a deepening entente, and as I said earlier, it's multidimensional. You look at military cooperation, diplomatic cooperation, economic and technological cooperation. Most observers say that the Sino-Russian relationship is the closest that it's ever been since the Cold War. So it is a multidimensional entente. It is a deepening entente. It is advancing with clear momentum. And so I think that we shouldn't be sanguine about that development. And I think that we hear this discussion from time to time about whether the United States and its allies and partners, might they be able to drive a wedge between China and Russia? I think that discussion seems more and more far-fetched if you look at this deepening convergence between China and Russia. So it is a multidimensional entente. It's deepening. It proceeds with clear momentum. On the flip side of the ledger, what is the Sino-Russian relationship not? It's not an alliance, as we just discussed, number one, and I think that both countries have an interest in maintaining flexibility in the relationship, but there also are real limits, and I think actually tensions over Ukraine highlight some of those limits. If Russia were to invade Ukraine, if Russia were to launch another incursion into Ukraine, it's not clear to me that China would go out of its way to come to Russia's defense, to provide it diplomatic cover. It's not clear to me that if the West were to impose even more severe sanctions on Russia than it did in the aftermath of Russia's annexation of Crimea, it's not clear to me that Beijing would really expend much capital to help Moscow offset the damaging effect of those sanctions. I think that China places much more of a premium on its competition with the United States than it does on its friendship with Russia. So I think that there are real limits. So I think that tensions over Ukraine highlight some of the limitations of the relationship. I think that while China certainly values its relationship with Russia, I think that Russia needs China more than the other way around. Russia, one of its main goals is to be seen and acknowledged as a great power. Well, a critical component of being seen as and acknowledged as a great power is developing your relationship with China. Absent a strong relationship with China, Russia's great power credentials, if you were, they become a little bit more dubious. If there were to be some rupture in the Sino-Russian relationship, China would still be, I think, widely acknowledged as a great power on account of its economic heft, its technological capacity, and so forth. So Russia needs China to establish its great power credentials more than the other way around. One last point that I'll actually two additional points that I'll make in terms of limitations. Look at the fallout from the U.S. withdrawal from Afghanistan. There was a narrative that was very popular in the immediate aftermath of the withdrawal, and I think it's actually even still now is a popular narrative that after the U.S. withdrawal from Afghanistan, that Washington basically handed Central Asia or handed the Middle East more broadly to Beijing and Moscow. I think that at first blush, that narrative, you can see why observers might subscribe to that narrative. I think it's actually misguided. Central Asia is a region that Russia considers to be part of its rightful sphere of influence or its domain of influence, and I think that Russia is wary of the possibility that China, via economic heft, might displace Russia as the principal, as sort of the linchpin of Central Asia. I think it's notable that as China is thinking about how it approaches Central Asia and the Middle East, China wants to reduce India's influence. Russia wants to deepen its influence with India. And so I think that we see that when we look at China's economic objectives in Central Asia versus Russia's security objectives in Central Asia, if we look at China's desire to reduce India's role in Central Asia, Russia's desire to deepen partnership with India in Central Asia, we see that the post-Afghanistan configuration of Central Asia, of the Middle East, is a potential point of tension between China and Russia. And one last point, and it's a broader point that speaks to some of the limitations of the Sino-Russian relationship. If you look at it, despite the soaring rhetoric, despite the multidimensional growing relationship between the two countries, I still think that on balance, the Sino-Russian relationship is more grounded in shared grievances than in common aspirations. So if you look at the joint statement that China and Russia published after the summit in Beijing between President Xi Jinping and President Vladimir Putin, it certainly articulates much more forcefully, much more explicitly, much more intensely what it is that China and Russia collectively denounce. They are much more vocal in their criticisms of the U.S. alliance system. They're much more vocal in their criticism of democracy promotion, much more vocal in their criticism of the post-Cold War configuration of the balance of power, much more critical of the role of the US dollar in global finance. So we see much more pointed and intense articulations of what it is that Beijing and Moscow collectively oppose. But stating very explicitly what it is that you oppose doesn't self-evidently translate into an equally forceful articulation of what it is that you collectively endorse. And so when we hear notions of a Sino-Russian conception of world order, a Sino-Russian authoritarian alternative to the current post-war order, it's not clear to me what the pillars would be. So one, do China and Russia, are they able to articulate a conception of world order that goes beyond articulating shared grievances? If they have that shared conception, are they closer now to operationalizing that conception? It's not clear to me. So I think that one of the limits to the relationship is it still remains more defined by statements of what the two countries oppose than statements of what the two countries endorse. And if you do have a desire, if you do have an objective of establishing a clear, coherent alternative, an alternative has to say something about what it is that you seek to do and how you propose to get there, rather than just saying what it is that you dislike and how you propose to oppose it.
So for today, currently, what is the current status of the Russian and the China relations, especially in the context of this crisis? And during a time, we are talking about time, the China also has a tension with the United States in the East Asia and over the Taiwan, South China Sea. And how can we define this relationship today, the current status of both countries?
It's interesting. So the Sino-Russian relationship, it's very difficult to describe. And if you ask different observers, and I've actually done this just to educate myself, to speaking with sort of veteran observers of the China-Russia relationship, and I've actually put this very question to them: how would you describe So I've actually put this question to colleagues, to friends who study this relationship, and I said, if you were to, in one word, in one phrase, in one sentence, if you were to try to distill the essence of the China-Russia relationship, what would you say? And you get a very, very wide spectrum of answers. So on the more skeptical side, you have observers who say this relationship, it's quite limited. It's much more beneficial to, it's very asymmetric, it's limited, it's perhaps a partnership of convenience on sort of one side. At the other end of the spectrum, you have observers who say it's a de facto alliance, it is an authoritarian axis that offers a clear countervailing conception to the present configuration of the international system. I think most observers are somewhere in the middle of that spectrum, but it's difficult to distill. It's difficult to distill the essence of it because it contains complexities. And as I was saying just a few minutes ago, on the one hand, I don't think that anyone would deny that the relationship, it has clear momentum. It's strengthening across multiple dimensions. I think it's the strongest that it's been in terms of its intensity, and the widest it's been in terms of its scope than it has been at any point since the Cold War. And so I think we can acknowledge those realities, but we can also acknowledge that there are limitations. And I think that it's notable that even though Russia attaches, I think, sort of top priority to developing its relationship with China for some of the reasons that I mentioned earlier, Russia doesn't want to be defined within the prism or within the context of US-China competition. Russia doesn't want to be reduced to an adjunct to China's competitive efforts vis-a-vis the United States. I think that Russia wants to diversify its strategic portfolio, and that's why you see that even as Russia is developing its relationship with China, and it's doing so very, very vigorously, Russia is also expanding its outreach to India. So just as an example, President Xi and President Putin, they had a much discussed summit, a virtual summit on December 15th of this past year. A little over a week before that summit took place, President Putin had an in-person meeting with his counterpart in India, Prime Minister Narendra Modi. And President Putin said at this in-person meeting with Prime Minister Modi, he said that India is a time-tested friend and a great power. Well, India obviously has an increasingly strained relationship with China, but Russia wants to cultivate its relationship with India. So Russia wants to cultivate its relationship with India. It wants to cultivate its relationship with Vietnam. Tellingly, both India and Vietnam have territorial disputes with China. Russia wants to see if it can expand its outreach to South Korea. So yes, Russia is developing its relationship with China, but it doesn't want to be boxed in. It doesn't want to hitch its ride entirely to or ride the coattails solely of China. It wants to expand its relationships. And so I see a complex relationship. I see a relationship in which it is continuing to strengthen in a multidimensional fashion, but I think that Russia has certain apprehensions. Russia is wary of the possibility that China will overtake it as the principal player in Central Asia, which Russia considers part of its sphere of influence. I think that Russia, in expanding its ties with India and Vietnam, it's looking for certain escape hatches in the Asia-Pacific so that it's not entirely dependent on China. So you see a very complex relationship. And again, just to reiterate a point I made a couple of minutes ago, this is a relationship that remains defined more by shared grievances than by common aspirations. And I think that in the years ahead, if China and Russia are able to articulate and operationalize a clearer vision of what would an alternative Sino-Russian conception of world order look like, I think that would be one signpost to watch. And two, are they able to get buy-in? I think that one of the reasons that China and Russia are developing their relationship is they both feel diplomatically more and more isolated. China is increasingly estranged from advanced industrial democracies, and we see this particularly over the past 2 years. The Quad has a new lease on life. China's relationship with the United States continues to deteriorate. China's relationship with the European Union is increasingly strained. So China finds itself increasingly estranged from advanced industrial democracies. I think that Russia, particularly in light of ongoing tensions with Ukraine, it finds that its relationship with the United States is increasingly strained. Its relationship with core European countries is increasingly strained. So China and Russia, I think, are turning to one another in part because they both feel diplomatically isolated from major powers. And so there are a number of dynamics in the relationship. It's a complicated relationship. I don't know that it lends itself to pithy encapsulations, but we'll have to see how the relationship evolves. One last point that I would make is, what are the implications for the United States? I don't know that the United States will necessarily be able to drive wedges between China and Russia, but I think that there are possibilities for perhaps introducing some daylight. And I think the one way in which the United States might be able to introduce some daylight over the long term is not to say, Russia, we're gonna forcibly try to poach you away and hive you away from your relationship with China. I don't think that kind of very, very forcible effort would work. But I do think that the United States could encourage Russia to it could remind Russia of some of the anxieties that it has about China, particularly medium to long term anxieties. I think that to the extent that it can say, look, assuming that Russia, you pull back from the brink, you de-escalate, there are possibilities for Russia and the West to have a serious ongoing dialogue about some of Russia's security concerns in Eastern Europe. There's a possibility for Russia and the United States to resume a dialogue around arms control. Russia, you also have options in the Asia-Pacific if you develop your ties with India and Vietnam. So I think that the idea is, rather than saying, we're going to try to introduce a wedge between you and your most important partner, namely China, rather than saying we're going to try to drive a wedge, instead say, look, you have certain escape hatches that can lessen your dependence on China. Think of ways, Russia, in which you can pull back in a faith-saving way from Ukraine so that you de-escalate, that you can resume some kind of normal conversations with the West. You can develop your relationships with countries in the Asia-Pacific outside of China. And so the idea is, if the United States, in a subtle way, in a gentle way, in a gradual way, can convince Russia that Russia can revitalize its economy and strengthen its diplomatic standing without having to depend so much on its relationship with China, maybe Russia over time, this is not a short-term proposition, it's more of a medium to long-term proposition, maybe Russia gradually over time says, okay, we'll continue to develop our relationship with China, but we don't depend exclusively on that relationship. And I think that that's perhaps what the objective of U.S. policy should be.
Ali, when we come to the sanction of the China or the sanction to the Russian military intervention or threats in the European continent, is it possible to say there is a number of divisionism increased among the Western countries, the European especially, when it comes to the sanction on China? Some countries, some European countries say that, how we can say, they're not sure. And when it comes to Russia, some attitude of the European countries is also same. Is it possible to say the divisionism among the Western culture is increased toward the Russian and the rising China?
So I think that on Russia, there's certainly, the United States and the European Union, they are not going to march in lockstep when it comes to Russia. And I think officials in both Washington and Brussels are candid about that reality, that there are going to be different approaches. I think that the United States will probably be prepared, at least when it comes to sanctions. I think that the United States will probably be prepared to do considerably more than the European Union. Having said so, I think that there's less daylight between Washington and Brussels today when it comes to potential sanctions that they might apply vis-a-vis Moscow. I think that there's less daylight than there was a few weeks ago or a few months ago. And I think in part it's because President Putin has overplayed his hand. If you look at the ongoing mobilization of troops on the border with Ukraine, and also some of the propositions or some of the demands that Russia has imposed, I think that Moscow recognizes are going to be non-starters. I think that there is growing concern about the potential for instability that could become a serious armed conflict. So I think that, yes, the United States and the European Union, they're not going to proceed in lockstep. There will be divisions. I think that the United States, in the event of a Russian incursion into Ukraine, I think that the United States will probably go considerably further than the European Union. But it doesn't mean that the European Union is going to sit idly by. I think that if you look at the press conference that was just held between U.S. President Joe Biden and his counterpart, Chancellor Olaf Scholz, now notably, and this reality got a lot of, or this fact got a lot of attention. A number of observers said, well, President Biden said, if Russia invades Ukraine, there will be no Nord Stream 2. Made that very clear. And then journalists said to put the question to Chancellor Scholz, will you commit explicitly to saying that if Russia invades Ukraine, that Nord Stream 2 will not go through? And the Chancellor, he did notably say there's no daylight between the United States and Germany, but he didn't mention Nord Stream 2. So that's seeming division, it got a lot of attention, but I think that the United States and Germany, they're more aligned. I think that the United States and France, they also are increasingly aligned. But having made this point, when it comes to dealing with a sort of a revanchist Russia, when it comes to dealing with a resurgent China, I don't think that we're going to see a uniform coalition of democracies. We will see divisions, and I think that that's why the emerging approach to, I think, amongst advanced industrial democracies to dealing with China, to dealing with Russia, is we're not going to be able to proceed in lockstep. We're not going to be able to assemble a unified coalition that deploys exactly the same measures at exactly the same time in exactly the same way. And so the idea is instead, can you form what U.S. National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan has called a lattice work of partnerships? And that is to say, small, nimble, dynamic groupings of countries that can contest Chinese influence and that can contest Russian influence in different ways. So, and I think that we see this lattice work approach particularly with China. So, whether you look at the growing prominence of the Quad, whether you look at the signing of the AUKUS agreement, whether you look at the US-EU Trade and Technology Council. So each of those groupings, these are small groupings, they consist of a small number of countries, but they're looking at contesting China in different ways. I think that there's a recognition as well that the United States, it's going to be more forceful in contesting China and Russia. The European Union, it still, I think, places more of a premium on the economic dimensions of its relationship with China. The United States places a little bit more of an emphasis on some of the security tensions in its relationship with China. But having said all of that, so we're not going to see uniform approaches, but I don't think that China and Russia are doing themselves favors. And one of the reasons we hear this narrative a lot that China and Russia, they're outwitting the United States, they're outplaying the United States, they are introducing division, and it's true that the United States and the European Union, they're not going to proceed in lockstep. And if we expand our aperture to include advanced industrial democracies in the Asia-Pacific, even the members of the Quad, Australia, India, Japan, and the United States, they are not going to necessarily march in lockstep on China. But I don't think that China and Russia are doing themselves any favors. I think if Russia were to invade Ukraine, I think that it would be taking very, very severe risks, militarily, diplomatically, and economically. The same goes for China. And I think that if you look at the risks, military, economic, and diplomatic, that China and Russia were to incur if they were to further escalate vis-a-vis Taiwan and Ukraine, and if you also look at their growing diplomatic estrangement, I think if you combine those two assessments, my conclusion is that China and Russia, they are enduring competitors, they are formidable competitors, but they're self-constraining competitors. And so I think that as the United States looks to how to manage growing competitive tensions with China and Russia, it doesn't want to be overly sanguine. One of the mistakes it made, I think, in the immediate aftermath of the Cold War, and even for much of the 2000s, was it perhaps was too complacent about the potential for China and Russia to emerge into serious competitors. But we don't want the pendulum now to swing too far in the other direction. We don't want to overcorrect. And so if we were perhaps too sanguine and too complacent in the immediate aftermath of the Cold War, I think that there's a risk now that we overstate the competitive potential of China and Russia. China and Russia each have serious internal vulnerabilities. They are pursuing, I think, self-limiting diplomacy that is estranging them from advanced industrial democracies. And so, China and Russia in many ways are getting in their own way, in addition to having to deal with internal vulnerabilities at home.
Regarding this Sino-Russian relations, I would like to mention one interesting point. The international relations scholars argues that the real Russian and China competition will start if China can successfully replace the United States as the global power. What will be your take on?
So I think that when we look at China's prospects, and then I'll talk a little bit about how Russia, how I think that Russia sees China. But when we look at sort of China's relationship with the United States and what its prospects are, I think it's very important to distinguish between intentions and execution, intentions and realities, these sort of long-term realistic prospects. Now, first on the point of intentions, there still is a very robust debate among scholars about what China's long-term intentions are. There are some observers who say that China, in due course, it seeks to overtake the United States as the world's preeminent power. It seeks to dissolve the current international system and establish a Sino-centric international system. So kind of there is a maximalist interpretation of China's long-term intentions, but they're also they're more I shouldn't say mixed, but they're perhaps less ambitious interpretations of China's intentions. There's some observers who think that China, it wants to achieve parity with the United States, but it doesn't necessarily seek to become a global policeman. It doesn't necessarily seek to undertake the burdens that are associated with or that are thrust upon the world's lone superpower. And then there are still some observers who say that, look, China is on balance, it's domestically focused. Yes, it's increasing its influence across the world, but it's doing so with the intention of securing the energy and other vital commodities that it needs to sustain a certain baseline of economic growth, but that China is still inwardly focused on maintaining a baseline level of economic growth, assuring the continued rule of the Chinese Communist Party. So on the first point, I would say that there's still I think a very vigorous debate among scholars of China's resurgence as to what China's long-term intentions are. But let's stipulate for argument's sake, let's assume that the maximalist interpretation is true of China's intentions, and that is to say, let's suppose, for argument's sake, that China indeed seeks to overtake the United States as the world's preeminent power. It seeks to overturn the current international system, to establish a new international system that is grounded in China's preferred norms, China's preferred institutional arrangements, China's preferred laws. So let's assume, for argument's sake, that China harbors those long-term aspirations. But then the question is, would China actually be able to succeed in achieving those aspirations? And I think that the reason that I think it's sort of a useful thought experiment to stipulate that maximalist interpretation of what it is that China seeks to do is we hold that variable constant, intentions, and if it allows us to focus on what China would actually have to do to bring about that vision. And I think that when you focus on what China would have to do to achieve regional preeminence, let alone global preeminence, it's a very, very daunting list. So let's sort of take let's sort of present some of the obstacles that China would have to overcome internally. China's demographic outlook is very bleak. Environmental degradation is taking a growing toll on the health of Chinese citizens and also on the potential for the Chinese economy. China's growth model is increasingly inefficient. And I think that you see with the embrace of what Xi Jinping has called this common prosperity agenda and also this growing crackdown on major Chinese technology companies, that China may be actually standing in the way of its own innovative potential. So internally, China faces a lot of very, very daunting structural challenges. In its immediate periphery, as I said earlier, the Quad has a new lease on life. So if you're China and if you're thinking about what can I do if I indeed harbor an objective of global preeminence, if you harbor an objective of global preeminence, you want to ensure that your relationships with other major powers are strong and stable. But what are we seeing instead? We've seen particularly over the past 2 years that China's relationships with three major industrial democracies that China counts as neighbors are deteriorating. China's relationship with Australia, deteriorating. With Japan, deteriorating. With India, deteriorating. If you look at China's relationship further afield, China's relationship with the European Union, it's increasingly strained. And then even further, China's relationship with the world's lone superpower, the United States, again, it's deteriorating. So if I'm China, if my relationships with advanced industrial democracies in my neighborhood are declining, my relationship with the European Union is increasingly strained, and my relationship with the United States is declining, that set of declining and or increasingly strained relationships doesn't bode well for my long-term strategic prospects. And so I think that one of the core aspects of China's trajectory is this gap between, on the one hand, its growing economic centrality, but also I think at the same time, its growing estrangement from advanced industrial democracies. It's very telling, actually, just in terms of juxtaposing the China of 2008 when it hosted the Summer Olympics and the China of 2022 today as it hosts the Winter Olympics. China in 2008, it obviously was nowhere nearly as powerful as it is now in terms of economic centrality, military modernization, technological capacity. But I think that China's relationships at the same time, China's relationships with the United States, the European Union, Australia, India, and Japan, they weren't nearly as strained. Today, I think that we see China is much stronger, but it also is much more estranged from those countries. And so it seems to me, if you can't secure a certain degree of trust, if you can't establish a certain baseline of trust with those major powers, it's going to be very difficult for you to achieve regional preeminence, let alone global preeminence. And for that reason, it's also going to be very difficult for China to get buy-in for whatever hypothesized conception of the international system it has. Even if China has in its own mind a sense that this is what our preferred conception of international order looks like, for any international order to succeed, you have to have a certain amount of buy-in from the countries that wield the preponderance of aggregated power. And that means you have to have a certain measure of buy-in from advanced industrial democracies. So I think that whatever your assessment is of what China seeks to do over the long run, I think that China is increasingly getting in its own way. And I think that it faces a fraught path to regional preeminence, let alone global preeminence. So that's a few thoughts on the first part of your question. On the second part of your question, how does Russia look at an increasingly capable China? Russia, I think, is of a mixed view. On the one hand, I think that one of Russia's principal diplomatic accomplishments since the end of the Cold War has been the consolidation of this entente between Russia and China. I think it's been one of arguably President Putin's signature achievements has been the strengthening of that relationship with China. And I don't see any evidence that Russia wants to jettison that relationship with China. And as I said a few minutes ago, Russia, it wants to be seen and acknowledged as a great power. Now, Russia, leaving aside China, Russia has the world's largest landmass. It has the world's largest stockpile of nuclear weapons. It has the world's largest proven reserves of natural gas. So Russia, and it's also a veto wielding member of the United Nations Security Council. So Russia certainly has a lot of great power credentials, but hitching its ride to China, it furthers this perception that Russia is a great power and an enduring power. So I don't think that Russia wants to abandon that relationship. It wants to strengthen that relationship. On the other hand, Russia is also wary of becoming overly dependent on just one relationship, particularly as the economic gap between the two countries grows, as China relies less on Russia than the other way around, as China focuses more on its competition with the United States than on its friendship with Russia. I think that Russia is also wary of a situation in which China views it as just kind of an adjunct to China's competitive efforts vis-a-vis the United States. And so I think that Russia is thinking about how do we simultaneously strengthen our relationship with China, but also diversify. So that means you strengthen your relationship with China, but also strengthen your relationship with India, strengthen your relationship with Vietnam, strengthen your relationship with South Korea. And I think that it also means, despite ongoing tensions between Russia and the West, I think that if Russia is prudent, if Russia were prudent, Russia would be thinking about ways in which it can de-escalate, ways in which it can restore a certain baseline of diplomacy with the West, ways in which Russia can continue its eastward pivot of sorts to the Asia-Pacific, so that Russia doesn't depend so much on China. I think that Russia worries about, in the medium to long run, a scenario in which China overtakes Russia as a principal linchpin of Central Asia, in which the economic imbalance between China and Russia continues to grow to China's favor, in which Russia's relationship with the West continues to deteriorate. Because if I'm Russia and I say to myself, well, goodness, if I attack Ukraine again, I risk the suspension of Nord Stream 2. I risk a further rupture in my relationship with the West. I become further beholden to China. Does that combination of realities really advantage me, my strategic position over the long run? And I think here we would have to say that the answer is no. And this is why I think we should make a distinction between skillful opportunism and strategic foresight. Russia has demonstrated that even as the United States wants to rebalance in earnest to the Asia-Pacific, it wants to prioritize competition with China, Russia is reminding the United States and the rest of the world that it can capture the world's attention. And I think that it's fair to say right now that even though there's concern about a potential linkage between tensions over Ukraine and tensions over Taiwan, right now the world's policymakers are predominantly focused on tensions over Ukraine, more so than they are focused on tensions over Taiwan. So Russia has demonstrated it can capture the world's attention, it can thrust its demands, it can place its demands on the global agenda, and it can remind the rest of the world Russia is a major power, it is an enduring power, it knows how to maneuver in a way that rivets the rest of the world, that focuses the rest of the world on its demands. So it's very skillful in that regard. But
Ali, from here, the Russia, when we evaluate the Russian power in terms of population and the GDP and economy, is credible for to be a superpower.
So it really depends on what your metrics are for, and I think it's a really interesting question. What makes, what are the criteria?
Oh, sorry, go ahead. The Russian GDP equal to the Italy, if I'm not wrong. So this is a very important indicator to be superpower.
And I think that this is a very interesting debate among scholars and policymakers, exactly your question, which is...
Also population is very important for a country to be a superpower.
Well, population, economic size, I mean, there are a number of metrics. I think it's interesting, what makes a great power? What makes a superpower? Now, I think that with China, very few observers, I think, would dispute that China it's a great power. It has the world's second largest economy. It has the world's largest population. There is some debate about Russia. And I think actually one of the most interesting debates right now among scholars and policymakers is, how do we classify China? There's a very, very vigorous debate. There's some observers who say Russia it's a great power and it's an increasingly important power. There's some observers who say that Russia is a stagnant and or declining power and its trajectory is increasingly bleak. I will say it's interesting that, you mentioned sort of economic size. I do think that it's interesting that there are a number of countries with economies larger than that of Russia that are not classified as great powers. And so it raises an interesting question. Well, why is it that many countries whose economies are larger than Russia's are not considered great powers? So what makes a great power? I think certainly the perception, I think Russia benefits from the fact, in terms of being perceived as a great power, it benefits from its stockpile of nuclear weapons. It benefits from wielding veto power on the United Nations Security Council. It benefits again from the size of its territory, from its landmass, also from its proven reserves of natural gas. So I don't in any way want to diminish the material assets that Russia brings to bear that I think burnish this perception that Russia is a great power. But to your question, there is still a very significant ongoing debate among scholars as to how to classify Russia.
My last question will be about the geopolitics, because our topic title is Eurasia, and Eurasia is very old, has history, the term of Eurasia. In the 21st century, do you believe that given the increasing the China-Russian relations, the Eurasia continent will gain in geopolitical importance, such as like the South China Sea, East China Sea, or like Persian Gulf?
So I think that Eurasia is going to become increasingly important, in part because you have, so China and Russia, they are increasingly contesting the post-Cold War settlement. They're increasingly contesting U.S. influence. China, its economy is growing. Its military modernization is proceeding apace. And Russia, I certainly wouldn't put it in the same category as China, but Russia is, as I've said, it's an enduring power. It's a significant power. And I do think that whatever happens with tensions over Ukraine right now, and let's hope there are, I think, some slim, and I want to emphasize slim grounds for, I think, cautious optimism that we may be able to reach some kind of diplomatic resolution over Ukraine. But tensions over Ukraine are not going to disappear. Russian grievances about the configuration of Eastern Europe's security architecture are not going to go away. So I think that those tensions, we should expect those tensions to continue. Tensions over the South China Sea are going to continue. Tensions over Taiwan are going to continue. So I think that Eurasia, both in terms of its economic and military import, I think that Eurasia's importance is going to grow. Eurasia's importance, judged by competitive tensions, is going to grow. And as the United States reorients to focus more on the Asia-Pacific, I think that Eurasia's importance is going to grow. So I think that pretty much no matter what metric you look at, whether you look at opportunities, whether you look at threats, I think that Eurasia geopolitically is going to become ever more consequential in the 21st century.
Because the both country, China and Russia, has a huge investment in the Eurasian continent in terms of military and economy, or the Eurasian Economic Corridor, or the Belt and Road Initiative. Compared to the past 4 decades, I think they increased. Also, when we look at the stability, I think the stability is also in a good situation now.
Absolutely.
During through the Eurasian continent.
Absolutely.
Now, there is a few questions, Mr. Ali. Let me bring the questions. Arthur Davis. While the biggest threat to American security is China, is the strategic mistake to expand NATO and send thousands more American troops to Europe? Good question.
Yeah, it's a challenging question. I mean, just a few observations. So I think it is important that President Biden, he has ruled out the deployment of U.S. troops to Ukraine. He has made very, very clear from the outset that he does not want America's response to be principally a military one. But he has emphasized, I think, kind of a multi-part approach to dealing with tensions. The first is that if Russia were to invade Ukraine, and here again I want to make the point that the president has said that the response of the United States and its European allies and partners will marshal in response to Russia. It's going to scale with the severity of Russia's incursion. So there's a spectrum. One side of the spectrum is a full-scale ground invasion that would elicit one set of responses, but there are many steps short of a full-scale ground invasion that would further destabilize Ukraine, that would elicit responses. So it's a combination of economic, the economic threats. If Russia were to escalate further, ruling out the deployment of U.S. troops to Ukraine proper, making sure that the United States and the European Union are aligned as much as possible, recognizing that they're not going to proceed in lockstep, but also holding out the promise of a diplomatic resolution. And I think that what we've seen, not just with diplomacy between the United States and Russia, but also if you look at a diplomacy between Russia and France, Russia and Germany, I think that there's a real possibility that the West and Russia, they can have an ongoing dialogue on issues that are of concern to Russia, whether it's whether it is missile deployments, whether it's troop exercises. I think the United States has been very clear in that regard that there can be an ongoing dialogue, but obviously for Russia, for Russia to say that Ukrainian security is a matter of Russian sovereignty, that's going to be a non-starter. I do think that we should have a discussion about NATO, but for Russia unilaterally to say that a sovereign country can't make up its own mind about NATO, that's probably going to be a non-starter. So I think we have to strike a balance here, hoping we can reach a diplomatic resolution and emphasizing diplomacy first, but also saying that there will be economic penalties in the event of a Russian invasion. Having an ongoing dialogue about issues that Russia believes are of concern with security. I think that combination, it offers a medium to long-term formula for de-escalating and hopefully continuing a dialogue between Moscow and the West, which is going to be very important.
Second question, let me. Christina Virtunen, what is the Mr. Ali's commitment about the table where Putin and Macron meet? Yes, this famous question. Do you believe that the two leaders heard each other at a meeting where such an important issue was discussed? the table really make me very happy. This table, I think, is very famous nowadays on Twitter.
Yeah,
It's very.
it's a big,
Thank
a very,
you,
very
thank you,
big.
Christina, for the
Uh,
question.
it was a very, no, it is a very, very big table. I think, and we're seeing right now that there are there's some differences in kind of the readouts from the meeting. So, France said after the meeting that Russia has committed that it's not going to engage in any further destabilizing maneuvers vis-a-vis Ukraine. Russia has pushed back, saying that, well, no, we didn't exactly make that pledge. So there are some differences in interpretation. I also think that President Macron, I think that he recognizes that there are going to be limits to what he can do on his own in terms of his shuttle diplomacy with Russia, because he cannot offer to Russia what it is that Russia ultimately seeks. So what Russia ultimately seeks can only be provided by the United States and NATO. Having said that, I do think that France can play an important role in helping to diffuse tensions between Russia and the West. So if France can serve in an intermediary capacity, if Germany can serve in an intermediary capacity, the UK, I think that if these European countries, if they can play an increasing role in diffusing tensions, they should. I think that any efforts that are aimed at de-escalating tensions, promoting a diplomatic resolution, they should be encouraged. So no, is President Macron going to be able to bring about a resolution to the crisis on his own? Most likely not, but I think that he can play an important role in mitigating tensions. And I think importantly, as I said a few minutes ago, diplomacy doesn't mean, what would successful diplomacy look like? Successful diplomacy would not mean that at the end of a few months or at the end of 6 months or at the end of the year, that all of America's grievances about Russian conduct have been resolved, and that all of Russia's grievances about NATO and various other issues have been resolved. I think success is more nuanced. I think success means that you ratchet down from the brink, you dial back down from the brink, you de-escalate, you agree that you're going to disagree in certain ways, but you agree to continue talking. And you are creative about diplomacy, you're flexible about diplomacy, you're patient about diplomacy. I think that's what success looks like. And so I think that going forward, we shouldn't expect real breakthroughs in diplomacy, but we can expect incremental progress. Hopefully, we can push for de-escalation, and we can agree to continue talking. I think if we can agree to continue talking and pull back from the brink of a land war, I think that we'll have registered an important success.
Okay, next one. See. Lucy Garnier, what minimum compromise in Ukraine do you think could be a solution?
So there are a variety of solutions that I think observers have put forward. I mean, I would almost say it's not even so much a solution, because a solution, at least when I hear the word a solution, implies that there's kind of a sort of a neat, tidy outcome in which all of the different parties are satisfied. I think that very often in foreign policy, your options are not good, better, and best. They're bad, worse, and even worse. And so I think that we have to think about of a continuum of suboptimal outcomes, which one is least suboptimal. But certainly, what would a few elements look like? One, we have to pull back from the brink of a military confrontation. So the most urgent, the most pressing objective is avoiding war. That's objective number one. And so I think that in the short term, the supreme objective of diplomatic efforts has to be to get Russia to pull back from the brink. Right now, I mean, Russia, depending on the estimates, has mobilized something like 100,000 troops. There's some estimates that put that number even higher. Reports that Russia is putting in place a number of other logistical arrangements that would suggest that perhaps it is contemplating a ground invasion. Although importantly, and some observers have made this point, it's not self-evidently clear if Russia's military buildup is it intended to actually make the preparations for a ground invasion, or is it intended to put pressure on the West so that the West continues talking? And it's not clear. But certainly, we need to see de-escalation. We need to see a continuation of and serious dialogue between Russia and the West. I think that the United States has made clear, to its credit, that there are certain propositions from Russia that Washington believes are non-starters, but that the United States is open to discussing other issues. A U.S. Secretary of State, Tony Blinken, has said, look, if Russia de-escalates, if Russia refrains from further provocations vis-a-vis Ukraine, we can have a dialogue, a serious dialogue about arms control. We can have a dialogue about missile deployments. We can have a dialogue about troop deployments. So there is space for dialogue. But number one, de-escalate, pull back from the brink, make sure that we don't see war. Two, a continuation of dialogue, serious, substantive dialogue. And three, thinking about sort of in terms of sort of bigger picture issues of global architecture. I really think that I said earlier that the United States is not going to be able to drive a wedge between China and Russia, but I do think that the United States should think about what steps it might take that could convince Russia that there are alternative pathways to revitalizing its economy, achieving a certain baseline of security, restoring some baseline of diplomatic standing that don't depend on destabilizing Ukraine, that don't depend on being solely beholden to China. And I think that that means, is there a certain breathing room for once, hopefully, we get past these tensions with Ukraine? Is there a certain breathing room for a very limited rapprochement between Russia and the West? Is there an opportunity for Russia to cultivate its relationships with India and Vietnam further so that it doesn't depend as much on China? So if the United States can prevail upon Russia that, look, there is an opportunity for you to re-engage with the West, there is an opportunity for you to develop your relationships in the Asia-Pacific outside of China, that there are ways for you to re-emerge on the international stage, some combination of those elements. So in the short term, avoid war. Medium term, let's have a serious, sustained dialogue that addresses both Western concerns and Russian concerns. And then I think over the longer term, thinking about ways in which we can convince Russia that it doesn't have to depend on destabilizing Ukraine and being beholden to China to assure its own vital national interests.
Just one small comment. The Russian analyst repeatedly talking about the expansion of NATO. They say this is the Russian concern, and also Vladimir Putin has concern to the US try to dominate the USSR previous area. What will be your take?
I think that there's a discussion. There's a discussion to be had about the prudence of NATO expansion. There's a discussion to be had about the membership of NATO. But I think that it's important. It's important that for a country that is sovereign, for a sovereign country to make up its own mind about whether or not it seeks membership in NATO, and obviously that is a choice then for that sovereign country to make, and then it's a choice for NATO whether or not we admit this country. But I think that there's a very, very legitimate debate to be had about given NATO's current membership, does further expansion does it serve the interests of the West? Is it necessary? I think that there's a debate to be had there. But I think that going over the medium to long run, the important point is that the United States and Russia, the United States isn't going anywhere. Russia isn't going anywhere. These are two countries that are going to have to find a way of coexisting. They're going to have hard conversations. They're going to have to engage in sustained diplomacy. And I do think that a conversation over NATO is certainly within the purview of that dialogue. So I think that Russia has certain grievances, and the United States and its European allies and partners should be willing to talk about those. But on the flip side as well, I think that Russia, I think that Russia also has to recognize that it has engaged, that there are certain concerns that the United States and its allies and partners have, whether it's about the destabilization of Ukraine, whether it's about the propagation of disinformation campaigns that destabilize democratic societies, whether it is annexing Crimea, whether it's the Russo-Georgian War of 2008, there are a number of very, very serious concerns about Russia's conduct as well. So they should talk. They should agree that they're going to disagree in certain areas, but they should never foreclose the possibility of diplomacy. I'm a congenital optimist, just by nature, and my biggest concern is if the United States and Russia say we have nothing to gain from further negotiations, we have nothing to gain from further conversation. I don't think that they're at that point yet, and I think that what we've seen in recent weeks with the involvement of the United States, France, Germany, the United Kingdom, that there is a lot of diplomacy going on. That's good. The more that diplomacy persists, the better. And the United States and Russia, they do have shared national interests in reining in nuclear proliferation, in hopefully getting some kind of Iran nuclear deal back on the table. So they have a number of shared interests, and let's hope that they continue talking.
Ava, Wojcik, what kind of advantage will China gain while the US focuses on the Ukraine issue for a while?
So I've seen versions of this question, and I think that the logic seems clear at first blush. So the logic is that if the United States is focused on Eastern Europe, if it's focused on tensions with Russia, that China will basically be able to put more pressure on Taiwan. It will be able to achieve its make progress on certain national interests in the Asia Pacific, while the United States is distracted. My sense, though, is that it's not clear to me that the United States is going to allow tensions over Ukraine to distract it from its overarching priorities. I think that the Biden administration has made clear that its principal region of focus is the Asia Pacific. I think it's made clear that its principal country of focus is China. Right now, Secretary of State Blinken is currently traveling. He's currently embarked on an important trip in which he's conveying precisely this message. He's saying to America's Asian allies and partners that yes, we are right now worried about tensions in Eastern Europe, but our focus remains the Asia Pacific. Our focus remains China. So, and I also think that I think it's notable that back in 2014. The Russian annexation of Crimea, it didn't precipitate a Chinese attack on Taiwan, and it's not clear to me today that further Russian destabilization of Ukraine would give a green light to China now. I think that China, particularly in 2022, this is a very important year for China domestically. China right now, it has to get through the Beijing Olympics, which have been shrouded in a lot of controversy over human rights abuses, over China's zero COVID strategy, and then China has a 20th Party Congress coming up later this fall, at which Xi Jinping is widely expected to secure a third term at the helm of China. So China right now, it's not clear to me that China right now betrays any great urgency about making a move on Taiwan. It has to get through the Winter Olympics. It has to get through the 20th Party Congress. It has to deal with the Omicron variant. So China has a lot on its plate. And it's not clear to me that tensions over Ukraine would give China a green light to do something on Taiwan, given how busy China's domestic agenda is, and given, as I said earlier, the very serious risk that China would incur militarily, economically, and diplomatically if it were to attack Taiwan.
The questions are coming. Just I'm bring when your time is limited, you can notify me, Mr.
Sure.
Tatiana Novik, in the West with Russia and in the East with China, does the US military have enough power to fight and focus on two fronts at the same time?
It's a great question, and it's a question that many observers, many military analysts are debating at this moment. I mean, one of the concerns, I think particularly, I haven't been hearing as much about it, at least recently, but certainly if you look at some of the commentaries that were coming out a month ago, 2 months ago, there were a lot of concerns, and I think that there still are some concerns about the prospect of a two-front conflagration across Eurasia. So simultaneously, hypothetically, Russia invades Ukraine, China attacks Taiwan. What would the United States do? Can the United States fight on two fronts? I think objectively it can. The question, to my mind, is not whether it could deploy military power to two fronts. The question is, what that type of scenario would mean for vital U.S. national interests. So the question is really one of prioritization. There are some observers who have even posited potentially a three-war scenario. So let's say hypothetically that negotiators aren't able to reach a nuclear deal with Iran? What happens if there is an armed confrontation, let's say between Israel and Iran in the Middle East, that draws in the United States? What would the United States do if Russia were to invade Ukraine, China were to attack Taiwan, there were to be an armed confrontation between Iran and Israel? What would the United States do? So to me, it's less a question of whether the United States objectively can deploy military power to two fronts. The United States is the only country in the world that can project military power into any corner of the world. It has the world's, far and away the world's largest defense budget, most sophisticated and technologically advanced military capabilities. The question is really sort of the need for priority, the need for choice. And even when you are the world's lone superpower, being the world's lone superpower doesn't obviate the necessity for choice. I think that as competitive pressures from China and Russia intensify, the United States will have to make difficult strategic trade-offs. It's going to have to make difficult decisions. It's going to have to decide when to contest China and Russia, how to contest them, and where to contest them. And I don't think that ubiquitous contestation is an answer. I think that the United States will have to be selective in how it contests those two countries. And so I think that what the question really raises to my mind is the imperative for the United States to compete with China and Russia selectively and prudently, rather than trying to contest them ubiquitously and on a reciprocal basis. Now, I should probably go in about 3 minutes, so I have a few minutes left before I should run.
Okay. Let me just this one. And Christian Cowlon. Putin demands that NATO doesn't extend into the territories of the former Soviet Union, but countries like Georgia and Ukraine are sovereign and independent. Can they choose their future?
Well, every sovereign country, and it goes to a point that I made just a couple of minutes ago, and every sovereign country should have freedom to make its sovereign decisions. I think no other country should dictate to a sovereign country that you are not permitted to do X, or you are not permitted to do Y. There's a conversation to be had, as I said earlier. I think that there's a conversation to be had about the strategic wisdom of further NATO expansion, and that's a very, very live debate across the world. There's certainly a discussion to be had about whether it makes sense for NATO to expand, whether a continued expansion of NATO would be advantageous to U.S. national interests, whether it would be necessary. But on the question about whether sovereign countries should be able to make sovereign, independent choices, definitely. But that's that would be for Ukraine and Georgia. Do they want to join NATO? Would NATO decide to admit them? Would it be prudent strategically? Those are all questions that we can discuss. But I think the basic principle that sovereign countries should be able to make independent choices, I don't think that anyone could or would disagree with that judgment.
Thank you very much, Ali, for great conversation, for joining me again.
My pleasure. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you. Also, thank you for my audiences for this beautiful question. Please don't forget to subscribe to channel and share this video with your networks, with your friends. See you in the next upcoming shows.
Okay. Take care, everyone.